how would you feel if over 100 protesters were killed by the authorities right here in Britain? That's exactly what did happen in Gaza. Israeli troops have killed and injured thousands of Palestinians who gathered near a Gaza fence for the climax of a 6-week demonstration coinciding with the opening of the US Embassy in Jerusalem. Israeli snipers shot at those protesters as over 100,000 demonstrators gathered to protest against the relocation of the US Embassy.
The Israeli Air Force dropped leaflets over the Gaza Strip, warning Palestinians not to approach the fence. They threatened to target Hamas facilities in the besieged territory if protesters breached the barrier. Palestinian witnesses said Israeli aircraft also dropped flammable material to burn tires which protesters had stacked to set on fire. The Israelis also fired tear gas at people inside the tented encampments which had sprung up along the fence. More than 1,000 Israeli settlers stormed a mosque compound in the old city of East Jerusalem, al-Quds, in a provocative act ahead of the US Embassy opening. Hardline Education Minister Naftali Bennett claimed the regime would treat the Gaza fence as an iron wall and anyone who approached it as a terrorist. Meanwhile, rallies known as the Great March of Return marked the 70th anniversary of when Israel was created and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were evicted from their homeland in 1948.
Why have so many Palestinians been killed? And how would we react if dozens of peaceful protesters were killed here in Britain? Simple questions with important answers. By mid-May 2018, over 100 Palestinians had been killed during the protests in Gaza, including children, with thousands injured with head and chest wounds. Why have Israeli occupation forces reacted so violently to a peaceful protest? We put that to the public here in London. Here's what they told us.
It's awful, so I don't think there's any really reasoning behind. I don't know if there'd be any reasoning behind it. I guess they do have their reasons.
The leaders are very corrupt, in my opinion. And I think that's really, really sad and disgusting if that's happening and nobody's doing anything about it.
These were, in the vast majority of cases, armed terrorists, men of military age, who were trying to breach the fence and enter Israel to kill innocent Israelis. And as much as we regret what happened, I think we also have to recognise Israel's right to defend its own borders.
I don't know, they should really be using tear gas and things like that. If they're trying to defend themselves because someone's shooting at them, then I could understand that, but I don't actually know what's going on. You can only see what you see on the TV.
There does seem to be other elements intervening in that, so it's not just a straight Palestine-Israeli issue. I think it's a disgrace, to be honest.
You know, it's complex, and you know, I know you only want 10 seconds, but I mean, obviously Israel present this as self-defense.
Violence doesn't really solve anything, and things like that in the world shouldn't really be going on, but it happens. But the government shouldn't let those things happen. They shouldn't let things like that get out of hand as much as they do.
I believe the reason why Israel responded in the way in which they did is because of the normalisation of such violent behaviour towards Palestinians over the last few decades. And the rhetoric used by those in positions of power in Israel, such as the Prime Minister, for instance, really in a way justifies treating Palestinians in such an inhumane way. And also because of the actions of the government. If your leaders are conducting themselves in a barbaric and horrific way, for example, with regards to the funding of the illegal settlements where the Israeli government has facilitated the occupation of Palestinian territories, which is illegal under international law, if your government is conducting themselves in that manner, you are likely yourself to adopt some very neurotic and barbaric tendencies yourself, because those who govern your society are justifying such an inhumane way of treating people. And also because of the way in which it's framed by the media, those who have alliances with Israel generally refrain from criticising the government and the way in which they treat the Palestinians. And this has allowed the actual situation to not really receive any fierce criticism or for it to be analysed critically.
For this to happen, there have to be decisions at a number of levels. At the political level, you have a very right-wing government committed to the gradual extension of Israel into what they called Greater Samaria. Also, Netanyahu may seem very right-wing to us, but there are people to his right. And so I think he's always in danger of being outflanked on the right, so he moves to the right in a preemptive way. So you have a toxic Israeli political scene in which is always moving steadily to the right. Now, so that is why the politicians maybe give the orders. Then the commanders, they're soldiers, in many cases, no doubt, very nice to their families at home, but as soldiers they are not used to being sensitive, and the brutality perhaps comes naturally. And of course the individual IDF officers have been taught to regard Palestinians as expendable. So all throughout there is the possibility and the incentive for doing terrible things.
Some have described the moving of the US Embassy to Jerusalem from Tel Aviv as a provocative action which has angered Palestinians. And now those Palestinians are being killed whilst protesting their right to return home and against President Trump's decision. What does the British public think of the US Embassy move to Jerusalem? We asked them.
It's a tough one. I personally don't think it should be a problem, but it's from the olden days. There's history behind it, reason why they wouldn't want it to be where it is.
I think it's a strange move by the US to get involved in something they probably don't need to get involved in, but if the Israelis wanted to move there, then if they own that land, then I suppose they're entitled to do that. So I don't know. We're not from that country, so we have to abide by other people's laws, and if that's what the Americans want to do, then and they're entitled to do it, then I can understand why they've done it.
I think his timing is provocative. I think the decision, clearly you want a consulate in each of the countries, but actually the connection with America and Israel is historically corrupt, I'd say, in that sense. So slightly worrying, I'd say.
The idea that was provocative, I can understand why that is perceived that way. Whether the US intended to provoke, that wouldn't be a very smart thing to do.
It being the government, there's probably a political reason why they did that, but I feel like they probably didn't take into consideration the people that actually are from that country and that live in that country when they made that big decision, hence why it's probably all kicking off.
I believe the US Embassy shouldn't be moved to Jerusalem. The international community have repeatedly said that with regards to the peace settlements between Israel and Palestine, Jerusalem should be negotiated, and there should be a settlement in which both nations have some sort of jurisdiction over it possibly, or whatever else the outcome might be, but nonetheless that outcome has not been reached. So for someone such as President Donald Trump to make such a symbolic and also hypocritical move, you could say, considering he would like to say that the US is trying to broker peace between both states, although the Palestinians, the majority, would greatly oppose that after his most recent move. If you think about it on a symbolic level, it is very disrespectful to the Palestinian people, especially the way in which it was done on the actual anniversary date is also further escalating political, social and cultural tensions. And in addition to that, I personally believe it is driven by egotism by Donald Trump, because he is a very narcissistic character, and for him, I imagine it gives him some sort of gratification to have had such a huge influence in the history of Palestine and Israeli relations, although it's been one of negativity, of course.
Well, it is one of Trump's ways of giving payback to his supporters, and some of them are Christian Zionists who believe that Israel is wonderful, that they're anti-Semitic, but they think Israel is wonderful. So the other reason is that that's his worldview. He's not very clever at working out the knock-on consequences. He's destabilized the whole situation for no productive purpose. He doesn't know what he's going to do next or what anybody else is going to do next. It is in that sense a disaster. It's a disaster for the Palestinians because what should be their capital is being subsumed with some support from abroad into Israel. On the other hand, from the Palestinian point of view, it has proved how widespread the support for Palestinian rights still is around the world, and the convulsive reaction against the idiocy of what President Trump has done. It should give Palestinians some realization they have capital in the bank that it can be drawn on. They have to find out how to do that.
Israel claims the heavy use of force is justified as a defense against Hamas. Israel has killed dozens of Palestinians since the demonstrations began, according to Palestinian health officials, while no Israeli casualties have been reported at all. What are the public's thoughts on this?
No, it doesn't. That's strange. I find that, it's weird that it is only Palestinians. It's weird.
I was in Israel recently and spoke to members of the IDF and the Israeli government, and they're absolutely clear that mixed up with the perfectly legitimate protesters from Gaza, there are terrorists, there are members of Hamas determined to do harm to innocent Israelis, and therefore it's a really difficult call. Again, we regret any loss of life, but in the context of Israel having to defend its border from terrorists, I think we can understand maybe why it's been happening.
The United Nations should be on this. They should be called in. They should be talking, and that shouldn't really be happening. We've got a similar thing in Syria. Everyone's talking about Syria, so surely it should be the same thing.
I think it's about the reporting of those events. I think also it shows to me that the strength of force is on the Israeli side. Clearly there's been hundreds of years of oppression in that sense, so have they got the resources to retaliate? No. Have they got the resources to demonstrate against such a force? No, I think.
Especially in different countries, like you don't know how the police work and the mafias and etc. So I feel like in Britain it's quite liberal. So if there's a protest, the police force, and 99% of the time they are good. But sometimes in different countries things happen behind the radar. Police kill people.
I believe generally, although Hamas do pose a threat to Israel and have supported some unethical acts, I would definitely say that the Israeli government use Hamas as a way to vindicate themselves of their own wrongdoings. And in actuality, their military and their objectives are self-defeating in that even if they do claim that Hamas does try to influence Palestinians to undertake acts of terrorism against Israel, the way in which the Israeli military are responding to Palestinians, the majority of whom are protesting peacefully, is only actually serving the interests of Hamas, which they say they oppose and which they say Hamas propagates, which is Palestinians undertaking acts of terrorism against Israel, although this is clearly not the case. And if you look historically, the statistics show in the majority of cases, possibly even all, but I can't say because I haven't seen all the statistics, but it shows in the majority of the cases when Israel and Palestine have clashed, the Palestinians have suffered much greater in regard to the fatalities. And it just further accentuates the lack of compassion towards Palestinians.
Israel has a track record of mounting provocations against, for example, Gaza, and then claiming that the natural reaction is what starts them off on a big scale activity. In a sense, the Trump move of the embassy is part of that. But in addition to that, there is the fact that many ordinary Israelis feel an existential threat from the Palestinians. I know on my visit and visiting friends and relatives in Israel that there are people there who have very nice liberal attitudes and they understand that what Netanyahu is doing is terrible. terrible for Jews, terrible for Israelis, terrible for Palestinians, and yet they are scared of what would happen if Palestinians were allowed to have the West Bank, which should be theirs. They're terrified that they would get payback for what they've already done to the Palestinians, so that the existential threat, which many Israelis feel necessitates vigorous countermeasures to keep the Palestinians under control, is a threat they had developed themselves. They could have made peace with the Palestinians, they still can, but that requires forgiveness from the Palestinians.
The Palestinian Ministry of Health estimates that 60 people were killed on a single day, the 14th of May 2018. Since the 30th of March, at least 111 protesters had been killed. By mid-May, over 12,800 Palestinians had been killed or injured. During this period, the number of Israeli casualties amounted to 0.
Thousands of soldiers, special forces, intelligence gathering units, armoured corps, snipers and drones were deployed by Israel against the overwhelmingly peaceful protesters. What does the public think about that?
They're exterminating these people. It's like they don't realise that it's human being. It's not. They're not even animal. You shouldn't be able to do this to. How could you just take away some people's life like that? How could you ruin people's life like that? That's just not fair.
We've had issues in London, so I can understand you would heighten security. I totally understand that, but that doesn't allow for the fact that you're shooting civilians.
The background to these protests were Hamas distributing leaflets, stirring people up social media, telling them, directing them. There were 13 different places where the border fence was attempted to be breached. This was an orchestrated attempt. This wasn't some spontaneous demonstration. This was Hamas orchestrating an attempt to breach the security border.
Yeah, I mean, it's sending out a message, but I mean, you've got to understand that Israel is encircled, it's such a complex situation. Politicians and others have tried to resolve this for many, many years. I mean, it goes deep, it's difficult.
Even when we have protests here and stuff, sometimes you do get a few bad people coming in, not even knowing what the protest is about, but just to cause trouble. That happens wherever you are in the world. But I feel like, yeah, that's just insane. It's a protest. Everyone's allowed to have freedom of speech. So the fact that they're trying to nip it in the bud so hard, in such a bad way, it's horrendous.
I believe it signifies Israel's aggressive stance towards Palestinians, is a very hostile position towards Palestinians ever actually having any sort of sense of self-determination. And this is clear if you think about the embargo which the Israeli government have imposed upon the people of Palestine, the air embargo, the land embargo, where they literally control everything which leaves and enters the country, which has had huge economic implications for the Palestinian people, to the point where the economy has suffered, calamitously, and its GDP is very minute, especially when compared to Israel's GDP. And this really feeds further into the narrative which the Israeli government propagate of Palestinians being, subhumans, and them allowing them to treat them in such a way. Surely, if any country claims to have respect, the government, claims to have respect for, democracy and freedom of speech and so forth, you would allow people to protest peacefully, especially if you thought so lowly of their views, because surely their opinions wouldn't be a threat to the actual system and foundations upon which your country depends.
It looks like a war, an armed conflict, except that one side hasn't got any weapons. So we have to decide, is this war, in which case there are war crimes, because you're shooting innocent people, or is it actually an internal Israeli matter, in which case law enforcement officials have a legal duty in international law to use minimum force. You only shoot someone as a last resort and only if your own life is threatened. The Israelis were bunkered down out of any range of anything serious that could happen to them. And they were shooting people like it was shooting in a game shoot. This is, as a United Nations spokesman has said, this is impossible to justify in terms of any kind of international rule of law.
If 60 peaceful protesters, including children, were killed in the UK in a single day, would the world react differently? and why? We asked the public.
Oh my God, everyone would be up in arms about it. Everyone, I feel like everyone on Twitter and on social media and stuff, there'd be uproar, they would. But I think 'cause it's not really as reported, is it, in sort of those countries, and that's sad, but it's true.
We know, that's why it's sad to see that it's happening in a third world country and it's okay. And for it to happen in Britain, it would never happen. They wouldn't even allow it to this happen. It's sad to see how divided the world can be. Depends on where you live, basically. Sad.
The government would go. It wouldn't be a Conservative government, it'd be a Labour government straight in.
So we would react in a different way here?
We would, yeah. But I don't know those, Israel this has been ongoing for years, hasn't it? And people have to protect their people.
Well, we've seen it with how when people were murdered on the streets on London Bridge and in the different cities, which is abhorrent, and it should be abhorrent in Gaza as it is abhorrent here. And I think people would be absolutely devastated and distraught about it, which most people don't seem to be, because it is a war and they think those sort of things can go on in war. But I find it distressing when I read about it, and that's it.
Okay, well, the UK's reaction clearly would be one of outrage, but then we are outraged again at what's happened in Gaza, but the context here is so different, so this has a different kind of profile.
In different countries, there's different rules, and things happen behind the scenes that no one even knows about. And if we did know about it, then I'm sure people wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So I feel like, things happen all the time and they get covered up. It's just horrendous.
Yes, I believe the world would react differently. I believe this is partly because of the post-colonial mentality. We are still led to believe, because of the way in which culture, society and politics is structured, that if you come from a certain region of the world, you are inherently inferior compared to other human beings. This is clear when you think about how many migrants drown in the sea on a yearly basis, and even the terms which we use to actually refer to these people, such as migrants, just like I actually just use, even what I just done myself, is self-defeating. And if you think this really devoids any sort of emotion and humanity towards these people, it doesn't personify them. If 100 protesters in the UK were to die, you would usually get some sort of background information about them. There would be profiles on them detailing their contributions to society, which rightly so would personify them and give you a sense of emotional attachment to them. There would be fathers, sons, doctors, professionals and so on. When Palestinians die, they are just Palestinians, And this really shows how we still live in a world where, based upon cultural inferiority and racial inferiority. And if you think about how Britain has historically treated Palestine itself, with the British mandate for Palestine after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, it's no surprise that there is a lack of empathy from those in positions of power in this country.
Of course, it's many more than 60, because this has been going on for weeks and weeks now. The tally of deaths is over 100, and the wounded are going into many, many thousands, often with the use of dum-dum bullets, which are actually outlawed in war, but apparently it's okay to use them on peaceful protesters. That number of 60 is significant, though, because that was the number of people killed at Sharpeville in South Africa in 1960, where innocent protesters were shot down, unarmed protesters were shot down by militarized police. And that was the event which started the slide of South Africa into its pariah status as an apartheid state. Logically and ethically and emotionally, that should be what now happens to Israel. Whether it will happen depends on the ability to mobilize the conscience of the world against this awful crime.
The death toll has drawn international criticism. Iran's foreign minister attacked the Israeli regime for pursuing a repressive approach to peaceful protests by Palestinians, and demanded their right to return to their motherland, condemning Israel for massacring countless Palestinians in cold blood as they protest in world's largest open-air prison.
But while Iran condemns the deaths and injuries, the United States has angered many Muslims and others with its embassy move and its apparent support for Israel's violent response to these demonstrations. And what is the protesters' crime? They just want to return home. And for expressing that simple wish, Israel has punished them in their thousands by inflicting injury and death.